The enemy sniper didn't miss. He never misses. He chose to wound because a dead soldier gets carried out fast, but a screaming one pins an entire team to one spot. That single calculated shot turned a reconnaissance mission into a death trap. And right now, Staff Sergeant Ava Carter is watching her best friend bleed into the snow, while a Barrett M82, her Barrett sits beside her completely jammed, completely useless with an enemy convoy 90 seconds from disappearing forever. Before we go any further, if stories like this hit different, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The cold came first. It always did up here. Before the wind, before the silence, before anything else registered in the human body, the cold arrived like a living thing, pressing down through layers of clothing, through muscle into bone, into the marrow of a person's will. At 9,000 feet above sea level on a ridge in rural Colorado, where the military ran classified training operations that didn't appear in any public record, the temperature had been dropping steadily since 0300 hours. By the time the sky began to separate from the earth, that thin gray line that soldiers learned to read like a second language, the air temperature had already fallen to negative 14 degrees Celsius, and it wasn't finished falling. Staff Sergeant Ava Carter had been lying in the same position for 4 hours and 11 minutes. She knew the exact time because she had been counting, not obsessively, not anxiously, the way a surgeon counts with the quiet mechanical precision of someone who has learned that losing track of small things leads to losing track of everything. 4 hours and 11 minutes on her stomach on frozen ground on a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley, the team at FOB Kestrel had taken to calling the corridor, a name that sounded almost polite for what it actually was. The only viable movement route through 26 miles of rough terrain, a geographic bottleneck that any force moving through this sector had to use eventually. And eventually had arrived. She could see them, 6 vehicles. Armored in the front, supply in the rear, moving in a loose convoy formation that suggested confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you are not being watched. The lead vehicle was an MRAP. RP, she knew it by the silhouette, by the height profile, by the way it sat heavy and deliberate on the frozen track below. The others followed in a pattern that told her something important. Whoever was commanding that convoy had done this before. They were maintaining irregular spacing. Not textbook, but not amateur. These weren't conscripts. These were people who had survived long enough to develop habits. She needed to destroy the lead vehicle. That was the mission. Stop the convoy in the choke point. Pin the formation. Prevent resupply of the hostile positions beyond the ridge. It was a clean mission with a clean objective, and under normal circumstances, meaning circumstances that bore absolutely no resemblance to the ones she was currently living inside it, would have been manageable. Nothing about this was normal. Ava. The voice came from 2 feet to her left and slightly below Corporal Mason Reed, her spotter pressing himself against the frozen ground with his left hand wrapped in a field dressing that had already gone dark with blood. Ava, I need you to tell me the Barrett is ready. She didn't answer immediately. Ava, I heard you, Mason. Then tell me. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. The Barrett is down. 3 seconds of silence. She could hear him breathing too fast, too shallow, the breathing of someone working hard to manage pain. The enemy round that had caught him 40 minutes ago had not been a killing shot. That was the thing that kept working its way back to the front of her mind, twisting there like a knife she couldn't reach. The enemy sniper had not been trying to kill Mason. The round had caught him high on the outer thigh, painful, serious bleeding, but survivable. A killing shot would have ended it. This shot was designed to create a problem that couldn't be quickly solved. A wounded man who needed pressure maintained on that wound, who couldn't move effectively, who would anchor the team to one position while comms were dead and weather was closing and a convoy was approaching. It was a trap built from a single bullet. She respected the thinking, even as it filled her with something cold and focused that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite fear. It was the feeling she'd learned to call clarity. How bad is bad? Mason asked. On the Barrett. Feed mechanism. Something hit it when I went to ground after the shot. Cam pin is binding. I can't cycle it manually and I cannot fire it. Can you fix it? Not in time. She paused. Not with these hands. She looked at her hands. They were still gloved for now, But even through the gloves, she could feel the first edges of functional failure. When your fingers stopped cooperating precisely when the fine motor controls started to fray at the edges like old rope you were heading toward, a countdown that your will alone couldn't stop. Cole didn't care about discipline. Cole didn't care about training or experience or how many times you'd done this before. Cold was physics, and physics was non-negotiable. Okay, Mason said. He said it the way people say it when they mean the opposite. Okay, so what do we have? MK-14. Another silence. Longer this time. Mason, the MK-14. I heard you. His voice had changed, just slightly, a shift in tone that she caught because she knew him, because they had been in the field together long enough that she could read his voice the way other people read faces. He was afraid, not of dying. Mason Reed was not particularly afraid of dying. He was afraid of the math. Ava, the MK-14, took that impact too. The scope shifted. We don't know how much it shifted. We don't know the direction of the shift. I know. That's a 7.62 at 1,140 meters. 1,140, yes. Against an armored MRAP. Engine block. You'd need to. I know what I'd need to do, Mason. She kept her voice level, not cold, just steady. The way you hold a door open against the wind, it takes effort, but the effort is invisible if you do it right. I need you to stay with me. I need your eyes and your data. Can you do that? He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I'm not going anywhere, he paused. Literally, I cannot go anywhere. Then talk to me. She was already moving, carefully, slowly, with the deliberate economy of motion that years of training had burned into her nervous system. She eased the Barrett aside and brought the MK-14 into position. It was a good rifle. She had always appreciated the MK-14, a different tool than the Barrett Quieter, in its ambitions chambered in 7.62 NATO, with a semi-automatic action that offered a kind of elegant efficiency the bolt action couldn't match in certain scenarios. But right now, its primary virtue and its primary problem were the same thing: the scope. The night force she'd mounted on the MK-14 was a precision instrument. Precision instruments assumed they had been calibrated. They assumed they had a known zero. They assumed the shooter knew exactly where the crosshairs were relative to the point of impact. She did not know that, not anymore. The impact that had jammed the Barrett had happened when she'd gone to ground, hard dropping fast behind the ridge as the enemy sniper's round had cracked overhead and then found Mason instead. In that motion, the MK-14 had come down against the frozen earth at an angle she couldn't precisely reconstruct. The scope had taken a hit. She could see it in the reticle, a faint but definitive wrongness in the way the image sat, a geometry she could feel more than see, but which was absolutely real. The scope had drifted. She had no idea by how much. Mason, what are you seeing on the convoy? She heard him shift, heard the wet sound of his field dressing pulling against the wound as he moved. He didn't make a sound about it. That was Mason. That had always been Mason. 6 vehicles, lead MRAP still pacing. Approximately 4 clicks to the entry of the choke point. Wind is picking up. I'm reading 18 to 20 knots. Crosswind left to right from your perspective. Temperature is down, which means your powder burn rate is going to be slightly lower than baseline. He paused. Your round is going to drop more than standard tables say. I know. And if the scope drifted, Mason, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Stop saying it and help me figure out how much it drifted. He went quiet. She could almost hear him thinking. That was one of the things she valued most about Mason Reed. He thought fast and he thought clean. No noise in the process. He assessed, calculated, concluded. It was why they worked together. Her instincts and his arithmetic. Her silence and his data. There's a rock, he said, 200 meters down the ridge from your position. The one that looks like a broken tooth. You've been using it as a landmark since we set up. I see it. That rock is approximately 800 meters from a cluster of frozen shrubs on the valley floor. I've been using that cluster as a reference point all morning. I know exactly where those shrubs are in relation to everything else. She understood immediately. If I fire at the shrubs, I can tell you how far the impact is from where the crosshairs were sitting. I can give you the drift. Not perfect, but close. How close? Close enough, he paused. Probably. Probably, she repeated. Ava, we're working with what we have. She settled behind the MK-14. The stock against her cheek felt different, colder, harder, more unforgiving than it had 4 hours ago. Everything was more unforgiving. That was fine. She could work with unforgiving. She had been working with unforgiving for most of her adult life. She had enlisted at 19, not because she had wanted to be a soldier in any romantic sense. She had wanted structure, and she had wanted purpose, and she had wanted to stop living inside the particular chaos that had defined her childhood in a way she'd never fully explained to anyone, including Mason. The military had given her those things, and in return, she had given the military something it didn't expect and didn't entirely know what to do with. An instinct for precision that bordered on supernatural. She had been identified for sniper training at 22, selected for advanced qualification at 23. By 25, she had a record in the program that instructors referenced. Without using her name, they just called it the standard, the thing you aimed for and almost never reached. Then came the incident. She did not think of it by its actual details. She had learned not to do, that had learned to keep that particular box sealed with a particular kind of deliberate discipline that cost her something every time she exercised it. She thought of it only as the incident, and the incident had resulted in her removal from the sniper roster. Official designation changed. Records amended. She became on paper a 68W combat medic, a role she was also genuinely good at, because the skills overlapped more than civilians ever understood. Both required steadiness. Both required the ability to perform precision actions under conditions designed to prevent precision. Both required you to be present in your body even when your body was trying to evacuate the situation entirely. But the rifle beside her, this rifle right now, told a different story than the official record. Ghost was still here. Ghost had never left. Okay, she said. I'm off to take the calibration shot. Convoy is still moving. I'm estimating 60 to 70 seconds before they hit the entry of the choke point. Once they're in, you've got maybe 90 seconds of viable engagement window before the lead vehicle reaches the exit ridgeline. So I have 60 seconds to calibrate and 90 to shoot. That's the math. She breathed once. In through the nose, expanding into the lower lungs, filling evenly, holding for 2 seconds, releasing slowly through a slightly open mouth. The breath was not a performance. It was engineering. Every trained shooter understood that breath control was not about calmness, it was about stillness. The body moves constantly, microscopically, driven by the beating heart and the expansion of lung tissue. The breath hold at the right moment in the respiratory cycle created a brief window of maximum stillness. That window was where precision lived. She found the frozen shrub cluster through the scope. The image was clear, good glass, even in these conditions. She set the crosshairs at the center of the cluster. Wind reading, she said, 18 knots. Holding. At 800 meters with an 18-knot crosswind, a 7.62 round would drift approximately 68 centimeters to the right without correction. She had the external adjustment dialed in, but if the scope had drifted, that adjustment was partially meaningless. She needed to know the baseline. She squeezed the trigger. The round broke cleanly. Good trigger break, she'd feel it if it wasn't, and there was nothing to feel here except clean mechanical function. The rifle moved, settled. She found the target again through the scope within 2 seconds. Impact, Mason said. His voice had sharpened. This was Mason in work mode, all the pain and the blood and the cold pushed to the outer edges of his awareness. Everything focused in the spotter's optic. Impact is left of target, approximately 18 centimeters left of where your crosshairs were sitting. She processed this instantly. 18 centimeters left at 800 meters. That meant the scope had drifted right, the reticle was displaced to the right of where it should be, which caused rounds to impact left of the apparent aiming point. Scope drift, right impact, left. Standard relationship. But 18 centimeters at 800 meters. She needed to translate that to 1,140 meters. The math wasn't complex, it was proportional, roughly accounting for velocity decay and the slight change in drift coefficient at greater distance. At 1,140 meters, that scope drift would produce an impact error of approximately 26 centimeters to the left of the apparent aiming point. That was her correction. 26 centimeters right of the apparent aiming point to get a centered impact. At 1,140 meters with a 7.62, she'd need to hold the crosshairs roughly 26 centimeters right of where she actually wanted the round to go. But that wasn't the whole problem. Mason confirmed wind, she said. Her voice was different now. She could hear it herself, stripped down functional, the voice she used when there was nothing left but the shot. I need a current reading. 20 knots, gusting. The gusts are irregular. I'm seeing surges of up to 23, 24. It's not stable. An unstable crosswind at 1,100 meters was the most significant variable she was dealing with. Wind drift at that distance with an 18 to 20 knot crosswind in 7.62 NATO, using a 175 grain match round, which was what was loaded in the Mk14, worked out to approximately 90 to 93 centimeters of lateral displacement, almost a full meter against a moving target. That displacement shifted with both the wind and the target's movement, and those two movements were not synchronized. This was the problem. This was the actual problem. And then Mason said something that changed the shape of everything. Ava, his voice had dropped, not quiet tight, controlled the way you control something that doesn't want to be controlled. Ava, I need you to look at sector 340. Just for a moment, don't move the rifle. Use your secondary optic. She kept the Mk14 in position, but reached with her left hand for the compact monocular on her kit. Brought it up. Sector 340 was approximately 30 degrees to the left of her primary engagement axis. She swept it up, found the ridgeline on the far side of the valley, and saw the glint. It was there for less than a second, a fractional reflection, the kind of thing you only recognized if you had spent years looking for exactly this, the specific signature of optics catching light at altitude. A scope, someone else up there. Someone who had been up there long enough to be patient, which meant someone who had been trained to be patient, which meant he's still on us, she said. Not a question. He never left. The enemy sniper. The one who had taken Mason's leg. The one who had designed this entire situation. The wound, the isolation, the trapped team, the approaching convoy, like a chess player setting up a board. He was still in position, which meant he was still watching. Which meant the moment she fired the Mk14, he would have her flash signature, her position, and approximately 3 to 4 seconds to react before she could move. 340, she said, elevation. Slightly above our position, maybe 15 meters. Distance, hard to say. Based on the glint angle, maybe 600 to 650 meters. 600 meters. Close enough that a well-placed shot from his position could reach her in under a second. Far enough that he would need to make his own adjustments before firing. She had at most a 2 to 3 second window between her shot and his response. If she was still in position when he responded, she was done. She breathed. The numbers arranged themselves in her mind with a cold, almost architectural clarity that had always been the things she couldn't explain about herself, not to doctors, not to evaluators, not to the review board that had stripped her designation. The thing they called a liability. The thing that allowed her to hold multiple complex problems simultaneously in a kind of internal suspension solving for each without losing track of the others. Mason. She brought the Mk14 back to primary, found the MRAP through the scope. The convoy had entered the choke point, moving at approximately 15 kilometers per hour on the rough frozen track, slower than on open terrain, the weight of the vehicles working against them on the ice. The MRAP was out front, maybe 60 meters ahead of the second vehicle moving steadily. Time, 70 seconds to ridgeline, maybe less. The lead vehicle is faster than the others. I need you to calculate target lead for me. 15 kilometers per hour, engine block of the MRAP, center line high on the block to catch the cooling system. She heard him shift again. That wet sound. The field dressing couldn't keep up with what the wound was asking of it. He needed to be evacuated. He needed surgery. He needed everything she couldn't give him right now. She needed him to hold on for 70 more seconds. At 11:40, a target moving at 15 clicks per hour. He was doing it in his head, she could tell. No time for anything else. You need to lead by approximately 30 centimeters. Hold 30 centimeters ahead of the front axle center line. She adjusted her hold. Scope drift correction 26 centimeters right. Wind correction 93 centimeters right. Target lead 30 centimeters ahead. 3 separate offset adjustments, or held mentally, all applied simultaneously to a single aiming point that existed nowhere on the actual physical scope. A point calculated entirely inside her head, expressed as a relationship between where the crosshairs sat and where the round needed to go. The numbers were not abstract. They were physical. She could feel them as spatial relationships, as geometry that existed in the air between her and the target. Wind, she said, holding at 20, stable for the last 15 seconds. 15 seconds of stability was not stability. 15 seconds was a pause, but it was what she had. Mason? She said his name and nothing else. She said it the way you say a name when what you actually mean is thank you, and I see you, and stay with me, and I'm sorry. I'm here, he said. His voice was thin now, thinner than it had been 10 minutes ago. Blood loss did things to the voice, tightened. It pulled at the edges. She knew the sound. Take the shot, Ava. She did not take the shot. Not yet. Because something had changed. The convoy had slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The MRAP's brake lights, visible even at this distance through the scope, had flared briefly, and the vehicle had dropped from 15 kilometers per hour to something closer to 10. Maybe 12. She watched. Counted. The vehicle held the lower speed for 4 seconds, then 5, then began to accelerate again. Not back to 15, to approximately 12, 13. Someone in that vehicle had gotten cautious, or had seen something, or thought they had seen something. And the target lead she had calculated was wrong now. She needed to recalculate. Target speed change, she said. I see it. Revised lead 20 centimeters, maybe 22. Acknowledged. She adjusted. The revised lead added another variable to the mental geometry, a variable that required her to essentially rebuild the compound offset she was holding, while simultaneously tracking the target through the scope and monitoring the wind and managing her breathing and not thinking about the enemy sniper, who was 600 meters away and waiting for her to show him exactly where she was. Ava, Mason said. There was something in his voice now that she didn't want to hear, a quality of urgency that went beyond the tactical. Ava, I'm getting... He stopped. Mason, I'm good. He wasn't. 30 seconds to ridgeline. The MRAP is accelerating again, closer to 15. Revised lead 30 centimeters. She made the final adjustment. Everything in her body that was still capable of precision. Every fine motor function that the cold had not yet stolen, every neural pathway that still carried signal. With full fidelity, she gathered it. Not dramatically, not with effort that could be seen from the outside. Internally, the way a fist closes slowly around something you are not going to let go of. She found the compound aiming point. Scope drift 26 centimeters right. Wind correction 93 centimeters right. Target lead 30 centimeters ahead. A point in the air and the white silence in the nothing between her and a machine that needed to die before it cleared the ridgeline. 15 seconds, Mason said. His voice was barely there. She stripped her right glove. The air hit her bare hand like a blade. 14 degrees below zero. And the wind was moving, and the sensation was not pain. Not yet. It was closer to the absence of feeling, a cold so thorough it read as heat for the first 3 seconds, before the nerve endings began to understand what was actually happening. She had maybe 60 seconds before her trigger finger would lose meaningful precision. Maybe 90 if she was lucky. She was not counting on lucky. She found the trigger. The trigger on a well-maintained MK-14 requires approximately 4.5 pounds of pull. She knew this rifle. She knew this trigger. She knew exactly where the wall was, that point in the pull where the mechanism is fully loaded, where the next fraction of movement will release the firing pin, where all variables are either locked in or they aren't. The wall was where you lived or died on a shot like this. She found the wall, held it there. 10 seconds, Mason said. The MRAP moved through her scope. She wasn't looking at the vehicle anymore, not as a vehicle. She was looking at a point in space, a point defined by math and physics and the specific geometry of this moment that the vehicle was moving through, that the round would occupy at the same instant as the vehicle. If she released at the right moment, if the wind held, if the scope drift correction was accurate, if the target lead was right, if the cold hadn't already stolen enough from her trigger finger that the brake would be unclean. She breathed. The trigger broke. The round left the muzzle at 850 meters per second. At that velocity, at 1,140 meters, counting for gravity and air resistance, and the crosswind that was pushing at 20 knots from the left, the round would travel for approximately 1.4 seconds before it arrived at the point in space where the engine block of the MRAP would be if the target lead calculation was correct. 1.4 seconds. She was already moving. Not far, not fast. She didn't need to break her position. She needed to shift it, change her silhouette, change her elevation by 18 inches, drop below the ridge crest where the enemy sniper's line of sight to her previous position would be blocked by solid earth and frozen stone. She moved with the rifle, keeping it with her because the shot wasn't confirmed yet and she didn't know what came next. She moved. And in the valley below, 1,140 meters away, the MRAP's engine vented. She didn't see it immediately. She was below the ridgeline, pressed into frozen earth that smelled like iron and cold, and something organic that had died up here long before she arrived. But she heard Mason's voice, hoarse thin, dropping to almost nothing, and what he said was not a battlefield report. What he said was, "Oh." Just that, one syllable. The sound a person makes when something happens that they had calculated but not believed. She rose back above the ridge, found the valley through the scope. The MRAP was dead. The round had caught the engine block high on the right side through the cooling system. The vehicle had not exploded, she hadn't expected it to, but it had stopped with the sudden absolute finality of a machine that has been broken from the inside. Steam and coolant were rising from the engine compartment in a white column that almost matched the snow. The MRAP had slid slightly. On the ice, the vehicle's own momentum carrying it forward for maybe 5 meters past the point of impact before physics finished the argument. Behind it, the second vehicle had braked hard. Too hard. She watched the rear of the second vehicle begin to slide ice under the tire's momentum that couldn't be stopped quickly enough, and the vehicle came to a skewed stop, blocking the track at an angle. The third vehicle, which had been maintaining inadequate spacing, came in behind it and stopped with less than 2 meters to spare. The fourth and fifth locked up behind those. The convoy was not just stopped. It was tangled in itself, a knot of steel and ice and confusion in the narrowest part of the choke point. She exhaled. Somewhere to her left, Mason Reed said very quietly, "Ghost." She didn't answer. She was watching the valley, watching the doors of the vehicles begin to open, watching the dismount soldiers pouring out into the frozen terrain, taking cover, establishing a defensive perimeter. She tracked the direction their weapons were oriented. They were looking north-northeast, away from her position, toward the earlier engagement point where the enemy sniper had been when he'd taken Mason's legs, where the muzzle blast from the earlier shots in this contact had lingered in their tactical memory. They were looking at the wrong ridgeline. She held that thought for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she looked left towards Sector 340, toward the 600-meter mark where the enemy sniper had been. Nothing. No glint, no movement. He was gone or repositioning or waiting for a second shot that hadn't happened. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that he was not firing. She put her glove back on. Her right hand had gone beyond pain into that particular numbness that she knew was not a neutral state. It was a warning, a physiological alarm, the body telling her that it had started making decisions about what it was going to preserve and what it was going to sacrifice. She pressed the gloved hand against her body under her left arm and let her core temperature begin the slow work of bringing feeling back. "Mason!" She turned. He was still there, still in position, the field dressing on his leg now thoroughly saturated. His face had changed color, that pale, slightly gray quality. That blood loss produced the look of a system running on reserves. But his eyes were open. His eyes were on her. "I need you to stay awake." "I'm awake." "You need to stay awake." "I said I'm awake, Ava." He blinked, slow. "Did I ever tell you when you first got assigned to my team, I thought it was a mistake?" "Mason, not because of you, because of the paperwork, the designation change. I thought command had mixed up the file." He paused. "I was wrong about that. You can tell me later. I'm telling you now in case there isn't a later." She met his eyes. She held them for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be real, short enough to be contained. "There's going to be a later. You don't know that." "Mason, there is going to be a later. I need you to choose to be there for it." He looked at her for a moment. Then, with what appeared to be genuine effort, he almost smiled. "Yes, Sergeant." She turned back to the valley. The convoy was locked. The dismounts were confused and looking the wrong direction. The choke point was blocked. The mission objective had been achieved with a single round from a rifle with an uncalibrated scope at a distance of 1,140 meters by a woman who was not supposed to be a sniper anymore. Ghost had taken the shot. The mountain had witnessed it. And somewhere below, in the white silence of a frozen valley, 6 enemy vehicles sat motionless in a trap built from mathematics and nerve, and the refusal to be only what other people decided you were. She lay still, watching breathing, waiting for extraction that was 47 minutes away. She did not know it was 47 minutes yet. She knew only that Mason was still breathing beside her, and the convoy was still stopped below her, and her right hand was starting to ache as the feeling came back, real pain now, which meant the nerves were still functional, which meant she hadn't lost anything permanent. Not this time. She thought briefly about Marcus Webb, the missing teammate, the one who hadn't come back from the earlier contact. She thought about him the way soldiers think about the absent, not with full attention, because full attention in the field leads to places you cannot afford to go. She thought about him at the edge of her awareness, the way you keep a door closed, but know exactly what's behind it. Marcus had been 26 years old. She filed that fact away in the sealed box. She would open the box later. She would open it when she could afford to. For now, the box stayed closed, and she stayed on the ridge, watching the valley, listening to Mason breathe. The cold kept falling. She kept counting. The feeling came back into her right hand at the worst possible time. Not the numbness, the feeling. The actual sensation of nerve endings, reconnecting with reality after 14 degrees below zero, had done its best to permanently disconnect them. It came back as fire. Not metaphorical fire. The specific, targeted, almost personal pain of tissue that had been pushed to the edge of viable function and was now registering its protest through every available channel simultaneously. She pressed her hand harder against her ribs under her left arm and breathed through it with the mechanical discipline of someone who had learned long ago that pain was information, not verdict. The verdict was still hers to determine. 41 minutes had passed since the shot. She knew because she was still counting. The convoy in the valley below was still locked, the MRAP cold and dead at the front of the choke point. The other vehicles arranged behind it in a configuration that would take time to untangle. The dismounts were still on the ground, still oriented northeast, still looking at the wrong ridgeline. But that wouldn't last. Confusion had a half-life. Men with weapons and training eventually stopped reacting and started thinking, and thinking men would begin to work the problem backward, trace the angle of entry on the MRAP engine, calculate where a round at that trajectory had to originate, start looking in the right direction. She had maybe 15 minutes before their search patterns shifted toward her ridge. She had been given 47 minutes of extraction window when the mission launched. She had used 41 of them lying on frozen ground with a wounded spotter and a jammed Barrett and a secondary rifle she had just fired in conditions that would have disqualified the shot in any controlled evaluation. The math was simple: 6 minutes of buffer. 6 minutes between the moment the enemy's tactical thinking caught up with reality and the moment the extraction bird was supposed to arrive. 6 minutes was not a comfortable margin. Ava, Mason's voice, lower than it had been 20 minutes ago. The kind of lower that wasn't about volume, it was about effort. Every word was costing him something he was pulling from a reserve she couldn't see the bottom of. Talk to me. About what? Anything. I need to stay. He paused. She heard him swallow. Just talk. She understood. Blood loss did things to consciousness. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was gradual, a slow dimming at the edges of awareness, and the best defense against it was stimulation. Something to anchor the mind to the present. Something that required active processing. What do you want to know? She asked. Tell me about the incident. She went still. Not physically. Physically, she was already motionless. Had been motionless for hours. But something inside her went still in a different way. Mason. You never talk about it. 6 months in the field together. You never once. That's not an accident. I know. He exhaled slowly. But I'm bleeding out on a mountain in Colorado, and I'm asking my friend to talk to me. So she watched the valley. The dismounts were moving in a pattern. She was tracking. 2 of them had separated from the group and were moving toward the south end of the choke point, which meant they were beginning a flanking search. Not toward her, not yet. But the direction of their movement was a data point she filed immediately. It was a training evolution, she said. Her voice was flat, not cold, just stripped of inflection the way metal gets stripped of paint in certain conditions. Advanced qualification, final practical assessment. There was a designated target, a simulated high-value target at 1,100 meters, moving pattern, full environmental stress conditions. She paused. There was also a simulated civilian element in the engagement zone. 3 role players, standard exercise protocol. Mason waited. I identified all 3 role players before I took the shot, confirmed none of them were in the round's path, confirmed the target separation was clean, took the shot. She stopped. And there was a 4th role player, not in the exercise brief, not in the pre-mission intelligence package. Someone from a different training cell who had wandered into the zone during a shift change. She let that sit in the air for a moment. The round passed within 11 inches of him. Mason was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. His eyes were open, still tracking. 11 inches, he said. 11 inches. You hit the target. Clean kill on the target. And the role player wasn't hurt. He wasn't hurt? She paused. But the review board determined that my assessment of the civilian zone was incomplete, that I should have identified the 4th presence before firing, that the shot represented an unacceptable risk profile. She watched the valley. The 2 dismounts had stopped moving and appeared to be in conversation. They weren't wrong about the risk profile. They were wrong about why it happened. The 4th role player wasn't in the zone. He entered it during my pre-fire check window. There was nothing to identify. She exhaled. But I couldn't prove that. The exercise documentation didn't support the timeline clearly enough. And so they pulled your designation. And so Ghost became a medic. Mason made a sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated than that. And yet, he said, and yet, she agreed. The 2 dismounts in the valley had started moving again, this time in a direction that made her attention sharpen west along the valley floor toward the base of the ridgeline she was on. Not climbing yet, not looking up, but moving toward the base, which was the first step in a search pattern that would eventually lead to looking up. She had less than 15 minutes, and she had just revised that estimate down. Mason, I need a comms check. She said it even though she already knew the answer. She had been doing comms checks every 12 minutes since the blackout hit, which had been, she calculated, approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes ago. Every check had returned the same result. Nothing. Static on the primary frequency. Static on the backup. The emergency beacon she'd attempted to activate after the first check had returned no confirmation signal, which meant either the beacon itself was damaged or the interference that had killed their comms was broad spectrum enough to cover the beacon frequencies as well. She reached for the radio anyway, keyed the handset. Kestrel Base, this is Ghost over. Static. Kestrel Base, any station this is, Ghost with 2 personnel, 1 urgent surgical requesting immediate extraction, confirmation grid follows. She transmitted the grid. She waited 4 seconds. She transmitted. Again, she waited. Static. She put the handset down. Nothing, Mason said, not a question. Nothing. Extraction is supposed to be... He stopped. She heard him calculating. Even now, even with the blood loss and the cold and the pain that he was not discussing, Mason Reed was doing arithmetic. Extraction is scheduled. They know the window. They'll come. They'll come, she confirmed. What she didn't say, they'll come if they know the window is still valid. They'll come if whoever is coordinating the extraction hasn't received information or disinformation that changed the calculus. They'll come if the hostile sniper who had methodically dismantled this team's operational capacity hadn't also found a way to interfere with the extraction coordination. She didn't say any of that because saying it served no purpose that couldn't be better served by watching the valley and managing Mason's blood loss and thinking about the problem in front of her rather than the problem she couldn't see. She looked at his leg. The field dressing was past saturated. It had crossed into a state of passive inefficiency, holding pressure on the surface while the deeper bleeding found its own path. She had already applied a tourniquet high on the thigh, which had slowed the primary bleed but created its own timeline. A tourniquet left in place had a functional window. That window was not infinite. She knew exactly how long Mason had been tourniquet bound, and she knew that the clock on that window was now more urgent than the clock on the extraction. She was a medic, not just on paper, genuinely comprehensively with the same precision she brought to everything she did. She had trained in both disciplines simultaneously for long enough that they had stopped feeling like separate things and started feeling like two languages for describing the same underlying principle. Keep the system functioning under conditions designed to break it. The tourniquet needed to be assessed. She moved toward him, carefully low, staying below the ridge crest, keeping her silhouette below the line that the valley dismounts could see if they looked up. She got to Mason in 4 careful movements and put her hands on the tourniquet. Check the tension. Check the tissue color distal to the application point. Checked his pulse at the ankle, which was faint but present. "That hurts," Mason said conversationally. "Good. Good. Pain means the nerve endings are still getting blood. You're not losing the limb." She adjusted the tourniquet tension by a fraction, tightened the windlass 1/2 turn. "Tell me if the pain changes quality." "Changes quality how?" "If it goes from sharp to burning. If it stops hurting and starts feeling hot instead." "Okay." He paused. "It's sharp." "Good." She settled back into her position, watching the valley. The 2 dismounts at the base of her ridgeline had stopped moving again. One of them had raised a radio to his face, reporting something. She watched the body language, the slight angle of the head, the posture of someone listening rather than speaking, which meant they were receiving information rather than initiating a report. Someone up the command chain was directing them. The command structure in that convoy was still functional. Of course it was. One dead vehicle didn't decapitate a command structure. It inconvenienced it, and inconvenienced command structures began redirecting assets almost immediately. She needed to know what they were being told to do. She didn't have that capability. Her comms were dead. She had no signals, intelligence, no way to intercept their frequency, no asset that could tell her what the man with the radio was hearing. She had eyes and inference said they are being redirected toward a search pattern, and the search pattern is going to expand. "Mason, can you hold a position for 4 minutes without me?" His eyes sharpened. "Where are you going?" 30 meters west. There's a secondary observation angle I haven't used. I want to see if I can get a better read on the search pattern. You're going to move on a ridge with an enemy sniper somewhere in sector. At 30 meters, I'm not changing my exposure to sector 340 significantly. His angle doesn't have clean line of sight to the western face of this ridge. I checked the geometry earlier. You checked the geometry before you knew he was still there. The geometry doesn't change because he's still there. Mason stared at her for a moment. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. If you're not back in 4 minutes, I'll be back in 4 minutes. She moved, low and deliberate, keeping her center of gravity below the ridge crest, using the terrain the way it was designed to be used as cover, as concealment, as a tool. 30 meters west along the ridge put her at a slight promontory, a natural jut of rock that gave her an angled view into the valley that her primary position hadn't offered. What she saw changed everything. The convoy was reorganizing, not retreating, reorganizing. The rear vehicles had begun backing up, the middle vehicles opening a gap. They were clearing a lane, not for the damaged MRAP that was finished. They were clearing a lane for something to come through from the rear of the formation. She watched, tracking the movement, and after 90 seconds, she understood what she was seeing. A 7th vehicle. It had been behind the visible formation. She had counted 6 vehicles from her primary position, but the 7th had been further back beyond the visual angle she'd had. It was smaller than the MRAP, lower profile, faster. As the lane cleared, it began moving forward through the formation with a purpose that told her it wasn't a supply vehicle. It was a command vehicle. And a command vehicle moving to the front of a stalled formation meant someone was making a decision. Someone was personally taking charge of the reorganization, which meant this convoy was not going to stay stalled indefinitely. Whoever was commanding this operation was experienced enough to not panic and disciplined enough to physically move to the problem. She had maybe 12 minutes before the convoy began moving again. Maybe less if the command vehicle brought something she hadn't anticipated. She started back toward Mason. She covered the 30 meters in 11 seconds faster than she'd covered it going out and dropped back into position beside him. His eyes found her immediately. 4 minutes, he said. Exactly. There's a 7th vehicle, command element. They're reorganizing. She was already thinking through the implications, running them in parallel. They're going to clear the MRAP from the track and move, maybe 12 minutes, which means extraction needs to happen Now, extraction needed to happen 10 minutes ago. She looked at the sky. The cloud cover had thickened since dawn, a flat gray ceiling that was sitting lower than it had been when they'd established the position. Low cloud ceiling was a problem for rotary wing extraction, not always prohibitive, but it added variables. It added altitude minimums and approach constraints and the kind of margin reduction that made pilots make conservative decisions. Conservative decisions meant later, and later was not a currency she currently had. She keyed the radio again. Kestrel base ghost, priority traffic, extraction window is closing, convoy reorganizing with command element, estimate 12 minutes to movement resumption, one urgent surgical one, routine requesting immediate extraction, beacon active. She transmitted the grid again. Waited. Any station, this is Ghost, radio check. The static was different this time. Not different in a meaningful way, not a voice, not a signal, not a break in the interference that she could build hope on. But different in texture, a slight shift in the quality of the noise, the way static has texture, if you've listened to enough of it under enough different conditions. She had listened to a great deal of static under a great deal of different conditions. She transmitted again. Kestrel Ghost, do you read? And then not a voice, not language. A single burst of static that lasted approximately 3 seconds and then cut off. Clean at both ends, not random noise. The pattern of a signal that was fighting interference. Someone was trying to respond and the interference was winning but not completely. Someone was trying. Mason? She kept her voice controlled. Controlled was not the same as calm, but from the outside it could pass. Extraction is responding, signal is degraded, they're trying. Mason's eyes had closed. She watched his chest, still moving, still rising and falling with the rhythm of someone who was present, who was choosing to stay present. Mason, sharper, his eyes opened. I'm here. I need you here. We have maybe 11 minutes. When that extraction bird comes in, I need you mobile enough to move on your own power. I'm not going to be able to carry you and provide cover simultaneously. I can move. On your feet. A pause that lasted longer than she wanted it to. Probably isn't good enough. Ava. He met her eyes. His were more alert than they should have been for the amount of blood he'd lost. She recognized it as the particular alertness of someone running on adrenaline reserves. The body making a final investment in situational awareness before the reserves ran out. I will be on my feet when that bird comes in. You have my word. She held his eyes for 1 second, then she turned back to the valley. The command vehicle had reached the front of the formation. She could see the door opening, a figure emerging. Even at this distance through the scope, she could read the body language. Purposeful, confident, the body language of someone who was not afraid of the open terrain, which meant either arrogance or information. Either this person didn't believe there was still a threat on the ridge, or they had information that suggested the threat had been neutralized. She thought about the enemy sniper, Sector 340, gone or repositioning. What if the sniper had reported? What if he had transmitted on a frequency she couldn't intercept? That the shooter on the ridge was isolated. One wounded communications dark, no extraction confirmed. What if the command element's confidence was based on knowing exactly how compromised her position was? That thought arrived with the particular clarity of a thing that you suspect is true but cannot prove, and it changed the weight of everything she was looking at. They knew she was there, maybe not exactly where, but they knew she hadn't left, and they knew she was running out of time. The figure from the command vehicle pointed directly up the ridge, not her ridge, the opposite ridge, Sector 340, pointing toward the direction of the enemy sniper's position or former position, giving instructions. The gesture was specific and deliberate. They weren't sending men up after her. They were directing the sniper. Get down, she said. Flat, immediate, no emphasis. She dropped below the ridge crest in the same motion, reaching for Mason's shoulder and pulling him lower without ceremony. He grunted pain sharp but didn't argue. Sniper, he said, being redirected. New tasking. He was watching us. Now he's hunting us. Do you know where he is? Hussein. Last confirmed Sector 340, 600 meters. He's had 11 minutes to move. She ran the geometry. A trained sniper with 11 minutes could cover significant ground on this terrain if they were willing to accept exposure risk. Could relocate to a position with a better angle on a ridge. Could be anywhere in a rough arc spanning maybe 200 meters of possible shooting positions. She couldn't clear that arc. She couldn't see it all from where she was. "He's going to pin us," Mason said. His voice was steady. She appreciated that more than she could say. "If he has a clean angle, he pins us. If we're pinned when extraction arrives, extraction can't land if there's active sniper fire on the LZ." Right. Neither of them said what came next. What came next was that if the extraction couldn't land and the convoy began moving, and the enemy sniper had a clean angle on their position, the situation moved from difficult to categorical. She had no word for categorical that she was willing to say out loud, so she kept it in the box with Marcus Webb and the review board in the 11 inches. "Options," she said, thinking aloud the way she sometimes did when the problem needed external pressure. "I can engage the sniper if he reveals his position. But engagement means muzzle flash, which means confirming my exact position to the search teams below. One engagement fixes two separate problems in two incompatible directions." "What if you don't engage?" Mason said. "What if you just move where?" 30 meters west, the position you just used. You said his angle doesn't reach the western face." "I said his angle from sector 340 doesn't reach it. If he's repositioned in the last 11 minutes, you don't know that he has." "I don't know that he hasn't." Mason breathed. She watched him think through it, slow, heavier than before, but still processing. "What's the alternative? Stay here and wait for him to find the angle?" She didn't have a better answer than that. Sometimes the options weren't between a good choice and a bad one. Sometimes they were between two bad ones, and the work was identifying which one left more future available. "We move," she said, "both of us, now. I told you I could. I know what you told me. Let's prove it." She got his arm over her shoulder. He took the weight on his good leg with a controlled exhale that cost him something audible. She kept the MK-14 in her right-hand barrel down muzzle discipline intact even now. Some habits were so deep they didn't require thought. They moved west along the ridge, low and deliberate, Mason keeping pace with a kind of grim mechanical determination that she recognized as the output of willpower rather than physical capacity. 12 seconds. 20. They covered the 30 meters and she brought them both down behind the rock promontory she'd used for observation. She got Mason positioned against the rock, checked the tourniquet still secure, and came up slowly to scan sector 340. Nothing she could identify, no glint, no movement signature. Either he hadn't repositioned yet, or he was very good at not being found, or he was in a position where her angle genuinely couldn't reach him. She held her breath and waited. And then 900 meters away, up the valley, in the direction that it had nothing to do with sector 340, she heard it. Rotary wing. The sound was distant, fighting the wind partially masked by the terrain. But she knew the sound the way she knew the rhythm of her own breathing. A helicopter. Coming from the northwest, which was the direction of FOB Kestrel, which was the direction extraction had always been supposed to come from. Mason heard it at the same moment she did. She knew because his hand found her forearm, not grabbing just contact. The touch of someone confirming that what they were hearing was real. "That's our bird," he said. "That's our bird," she confirmed. And in the valley below, the figure standing beside the command vehicle heard it too. She watched the reaction through the scope, the head turning, the arm rising to point northwest, the other arm coming up with a radio. Orders going out, to the dismounts on the valley floor, to the search teams, to the sniper she still couldn't locate. Everyone was repositioning now. The question was, who got there first? She keyed the radio one final time, knowing the extraction bird was close enough that its systems might be able to punch through the interference. "Ghost to extraction. We are at secondary position, 30 meters west of primary 2 personnel. LZ is not secure. Repeat. LZ is not secure. Hostile. Sniper active in sector approach from the northwest. With caution, we will mark on your call." Static, then breaking through the static like something solid hitting glass, a single voice. "Ghost Reaper 6. We have you. 30 seconds. Mason's grip on her forearm tightened. She looked at him. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes were open and full of something she didn't have a word for in the professional vocabulary, something human and unreserved and completely real. "Get up," she said. "On your feet, Mason, right now." He got up. She put herself between him and sector 340 because if the sniper had a clean angle and was going to take a shot at the moving targets working toward an LZ, she was going to make sure the first thing that shot hit was her. The helicopter came over the ridge. She was already moving. The helicopter didn't land. That was the first thing she registered. Not with panic, not with disbelief, but with the cold, immediate pragmatism of someone whose brain had been running contingency calculations for the last 4 hours. The UH-60 came in low and fast over the northwest ridgeline, nose pitched forward, moving with the aggressive speed of a crew that had been briefed on a hot extraction and taken that briefing seriously. It crossed the ridge at approximately 40 feet of altitude, and then the pilot flared hard, pulling the nose up, bleeding speed, transitioning from forward flight to a hover that lasted exactly 2 seconds before the aircraft began moving again. Not landing, orbiting, circling the position at 50 feet with the side door open and a crew chief leaning out with a harness rig visible in his hands. They weren't going to set down. She understood why in the same instant she registered the decision. Setting down meant stopping. Stopping on a ridge with an active hostile sniper somewhere in a 600-meter arc meant presenting a stationary target that a competent shooter could engage before the rotors finished spooling down. The pilot had made the right call. It was also a call that created a problem she now had approximately 30 seconds to solve. Getting Mason Reed into a hoist harness with one good leg under rotor wash and 14 below air, with a hostile sniper potentially acquiring the LZ, was a problem with a lot of moving parts. She was already working it. "Mason, hoist rig, can you get your arms up?" He looked at the helicopter. Something moved through his expression. Not fear, not relief. Something more complicated than either. The look of a man who understood exactly what the next 60 seconds required and was making a private decision about whether he had what it took to get through them. She watched him make that decision in real time and watched him land on yes. "Get my arms up," he said. "Yes." The crew chief is going to drop the harness. When it hits the ground, you grab the left shoulder strap first, not the right. "Left. I'll get the right." We buckle center chest and then I signal. "Can you remember that?" "Left shoulder first, center buckle, you signal. Don't let go of the left strap until I have the right." "I heard you." The harness came down on a cable that the wind immediately tried to turn into a problem. Swinging it east away from their position, the crew chief compensating by feeding cable faster than the swing could develop. The harness hit the frozen ground 6 feet to her right, and she was on it before it stopped moving, grabbing the left strap and pulling it toward Mason in one continuous motion. "Left shoulder," she said. He got his arm through. His face went tight, the shoulder movement, pulling something in the leg wound that the tourniquet hadn't fully addressed. He made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, something in between that she filed and moved past because there was no time to address it. She had the right strap. She pulled it across his chest. His hands found the buckle, and she put her hands over his because his fingers were not cooperating at the speed the situation required. She felt the buckle engage the mechanical click of a latch that was now the most important sound in the world. She looked up at the crew chief, gave him the thumbs up. The cable went taut. Mason left the ground. She kept her hand on his arm until the last possible moment, until the physics of the hoist made it impossible to maintain contact, and then she let go and stepped back and watched him go up. He was conscious. She could tell because he was looking down at her. Not saying anything, just looking. The look of a man being pulled away from something he doesn't entirely want to leave. She understood that look. She turned back to the ridge. The MK-14 was in her hands. She wasn't entirely certain when she had picked it up. Muscle memory, the body making decisions that conscious thought hadn't authorized yet. She was scanning Sector 340, working the arc systematically, looking for the thing she hadn't been able to find in the last 11 minutes. The sniper. The one who had built this entire situation. The one who was somewhere out there in that arc, potentially watching the hoist operation, potentially acquiring the helicopter, potentially making a decision about whether the shot was worth taking. A hit on a UH-60 at this range was not guaranteed. It was possible enough that she needed to think about it. The cable retracted. She heard the crew chief's voice, distant, wind distorted, calling something down to her. The harness was coming back down for her. She didn't move toward it. Not yet. Because something in Sector 340 had changed. It wasn't a glint this time. It wasn't reflected light or a visible signature. It was movement peripheral brief, the kind of movement that registers in human vision, precisely because human vision evolved to detect motion in peripheral field. as a survival mechanism. Something had moved at approximately 580 meters, slightly north of her previous estimate of the sniper's position. The movement was consistent with a person adjusting their body position. The kind of micro-adjustment a shooter makes when they have acquired a target and are making final corrections. He had the helicopter. The thought arrived with absolute certainty and zero drama. He had the helicopter in his scope, and he was adjusting for the aircraft's movement, and in the next 4 to 6 seconds, he was going to fire. She had no shot. She had no confirmed position. She had peripheral movement and an inference in the Mk-14 that had just been fired once in calibration and once in the mission, and was running on a scope that she had corrected empirically rather than precisely, and a barrel that was cold again, and a right hand that was still not fully functional. She had no shot. But she had something else. She had his attention. She stood up. Not all the way, she came up to a kneeling position above the ridge crest, visible against the skyline, a silhouette that any trained observer looking at this ridge would immediately register. She brought the Mk-14 up to her shoulder, not aimed at anything real, aimed at the arc, a posture that said, "I can see you and I am about to fire." She was bluffing with a rifle. It was the most insane thing she had ever done, and she had done some insane things. The helicopter banked hard to the left. She saw it in her peripheral vision, the pilot reacting to something, possibly a call from the crew chief, possibly his own threat awareness. The bank took the aircraft out of the immediate hover position and moved it laterally, changing the target geometry, making the shot harder for anyone who had been tracking the previous position. She heard the shot, not the impact, the shot, the crack of a supersonic round passing through cold air, the specific acoustic signature of a high-powered rifle firing at distance. It came from the arc from somewhere inside the 500 to 600 meter range she'd estimated, and it did not hit the helicopter. She watched the aircraft. The tail did not change the rotor sound, did not change the flight path, continued in the new direction without the sudden, catastrophic interruption that a hit would produce. He had missed. She had broken his acquisition. The movement, the posture, the bluff, it had worked the way a bluff works when the other person doesn't have enough information to call it. He had shifted his attention from the helicopter to the threat on the ridge, and in shifting attention, he had lost the firing solution he'd built, and the shot he'd taken in the transition had missed. She was already dropping back below the ridge crest. "Ghost!" The crew chief's voice from the helicopter carried down through the open door, fighting wind and rotor noise. "Ghost, we need to go, right now." She ran for the harness. Running on a frozen ridge with a rifle in your hands was an exercise in controlled recklessness. Each footfall, a negotiation between the speed the situation demanded and the traction the terrain could offer. She covered the distance to the swinging harness in 8 seconds, grabbed it, got her left arm through the shoulder strap, her right arm through, reached for the center buckle with fingers that were better than they'd been at their worst, but still not what she'd call reliable. The buckle didn't catch on the first try. She felt it, the mechanism sliding past the latch point, the buckle failing to engage. Her right hand, the cold, the specific imprecision that several hours at -14 degrees had introduced into the system. She tried again. The helicopter was moving. She could feel it in the cable tension changing the aircraft, drifting, slightly the crew chief compensating. They were not going to hold position much longer. The pilot was making decisions up there based on information she didn't have, and those decisions were producing a situation in which the cable was not going to stay slack enough for her to keep working this buckle. "Come on," she said, out loud, to the buckle, to her hand, to whatever part of herself was still capable of responding to direct instruction. The buckle caught, the cable went taut. Her feet left the ground and the ridge fell away below her, and the cold hit her differently now. Not the ground cold, the air cold, moving air at altitude, the rotor wash adding its own wind to the existing wind and creating something that felt like flying through a very small, very personal blizzard. She curled around the rifle. She was not going to lose the Mk-14. That was not a thing that was going to happen, and looked down. The valley was below her. The convoy was below her. The choke point with the dead MRAP and the tangled formation of 5 other vehicles. She could see the dismount, small from this altitude, moving in patterns she could read even now, even hanging from a cable and rotor wash. They were looking up. They could see the helicopter. Some of them were raising weapons. She heard rounds, not impact sounds. The distinctive crack and thump of small arms fire from below the rounds, going wide the range and the angle, and the aircraft's movement working against accurate fire from the valley floor. Then she was inside the helicopter, and the crew chief had his hands on her harness and was unclipping her from the hoist cable with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before in conditions that didn't allow for anything less than practiced efficiency. She sat on the floor of the aircraft. Mason was across from her, strapped to the opposite wall, a flight medic already working on his leg, with equipment that was several generations more capable than the field dressing she'd applied on the ridge. He was conscious. His eyes were on her. When she sat down, something in his face changed, a release of something he'd been holding since the moment she'd let go of his arm on the ridge. She understood that too. The helicopter banked north, nose down building speed, toward FOB Kestrel. The crew chief was talking into his helmet, calm, reporting something, his voice inaudible to her without a headset. She looked out the open door back toward the valley and watched it diminish as the aircraft gained distance. She thought about Marcus Webb. She let herself think about him fully now that the box could be opened. 26 years old, from Roanoke, Virginia. He had a sister named Deja and a mother who called him every Sunday without exception, and a habit of carrying a small, worn-out paperback novel in his left cargo pocket that he'd been reading in pieces for the 8 months he'd been assigned to this unit. She'd never asked him what the novel was. She wished she had asked him. He had gone into the earlier contact, the first engagement, 3 hours before the convoy appeared, and he had not come back. The radio had gone silent on his frequency 11 minutes into that contact. That silence had been the first domino in the sequence that had produced everything that followed. The repositioning, the exposure, the enemy snipers, calculated shot, Mason's wound, the jammed Barrett, the calibration under pressure, the shot that stopped the convoy. All of it traced back to that 11 minutes of silence. She would never know, not with certainty, what had happened in those 11 minutes. The official determination would come later from the after-action review, from whatever evidence the recovery team found from the documentation that the military built around its losses, the way it built everything systematically with forms and language designed to contain the uncontainable. She would read that documentation. She would read every word of it, and it would tell her facts without telling her the things she actually wanted to know, which was whether Marcus Webb had been afraid at the end, or whether he had been the version of himself she'd known in the field, focused and dry-humored and competent and irritatingly good at cards. She hoped it had been that version. The flight medic said something to her. She realized she'd been staring at the open door without seeing it and brought her attention back to the interior of the aircraft. "Ma'am, are you injured?" She assessed herself, genuinely clinically the way she'd been trained to assess others. Right hand functional impaired fine motor. Likely mild frost nip, but not frostbite. Recovery probable with rewarming. Left hand intact. Body no penetrating injuries, no bone involvement, no neurological symptoms she could identify from the inside. Cold exposure throughout dehydration likely. Approximately 4 hours of extreme isometric muscle engagement, producing fatigue that she was only now beginning to feel because the mission had been suppressing it. "I'm okay," she said. The flight medic looked at her the way medics look at patients who say they're okay, with professional skepticism and the knowledge that people in high-stress situations are genuinely unreliable reporters of their own physical state. "Let me check your hands." She let him check her hands. He worked in silence for a moment, examining her right hand with a pen light, checking capillary refill testing sensation with a touch pattern she recognized because she had administered the same test herself more times than she could count. He looked up at her. Mild frost nip, second and third fingers right hand. Rewarming is going to be uncomfortable. It already is. "Good sign," he said. And then, as if he'd learned something from the crew chief, he added, "They're saying you made a shot at 1,100 meters from a rifle with a drifted scope." She looked at him. He was young, mid-20s, the particular youth of someone who had come into this work with enthusiasm and was in the process of having that enthusiasm educated by reality. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was asking for something else. The thing people ask for when they've heard something that doesn't fit inside their existing framework. "I made a shot," she said, "against an armored vehicle. Engine block." He absorbed this. "What did you use the Barrett?" "The Barrett was down." She paused. MK-14, 7.62. He stared at her for a moment. Then he went back to treating her hand, and she could see him filing the information somewhere in the architecture of his professional experience. A drawer that didn't have a label yet, but would eventually get one. She looked across at Mason. He was watching her. The flight medic working on his leg had gotten an IV started. She could see the line running from a bag clipped to the overhead rail, clear fluid moving down the tube at a rate that told her they were running a bolus replacing volume fast. His color was better than it had been on the ridge. The aircraft's warmth was already doing work. His eyes were clearer. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like I did something extraordinary." He almost smiled. "You bluffed a sniper with an empty rifle." "The rifle wasn't empty. I had rounds." "But you weren't going to shoot." She held his gaze for 1 second. "I might have shot. You didn't have a position. I had an arc. Ava, you stood up on a ridgeline to draw a sniper's attention away from a helicopter. That's not a tactic. That's a decision about what matters more than your own life." She looked away. Not because he was wrong, because he was right in a way that required more space than a helicopter floor could offer. The decision she'd made in that moment to stand up to present herself as a target to trade her own safety for the aircraft's safety had not been a tactical calculation. It had happened below the level of calculation. It had happened in the same place the shot had come from, the same place the scope drift correction and the target lead and the trigger brake had come from. A place that didn't have a name she was comfortable using. The military had tried to close that place. The review board had written a report that was in its clinical way an attempt to seal it off. Too dangerous, too uncontrollable, too outside the parameters of acceptable risk. And for 2 years, she had accepted that characterization with a compliance that she now understood was its own kind of lie. Not a conscious lie, but the slow, accumulated lie of pretending that half of yourself doesn't exist. The mountain had stopped that lie today. She realized Mason had said something she'd missed. "Sorry, say again." "I said, what are you thinking about?" "Marcus." The words sat between them in the rotor noise. Mason's face changed, the professional composure shifting just at the edges to something more honest. "Yeah," he said, "me too." She looked at the MK-14 in her lap. She had kept it. She would keep it. Not as a trophy, she didn't do trophies. As evidence. The physical proof of a thing that had happened, that she had done, that no document could unwrite. The scope that she had recalibrated with a coin and a spent casing, and 11 minutes of remaining window, and a hostile sniper watching from Sector 340. The scope that was now zeroed, perfectly verifiably zeroed, because after the calibration shot and the mission shot, she had confirmed the data. The drift correction that had taken a round fired at 800 meters and produced an impact that told her exactly what she needed to know about 1140. She had re-zeroed a precision rifle on a frozen mountain with improvised tools and produced a clean engine block hit on a moving armored vehicle in a 20-knot crosswind at 14 degrees below zero. She had done that. Ghost had done that. The helicopter banked again, beginning its approach to FOB Kestrel, and through the open door she could see the structures of the forward operating base appearing in the gray morning light. Buildings that represented warmth and communication and the particular institutional machinery that was going to want answers from her very shortly. Debrief. After action. The official process of accounting for what had happened in the hours before this helicopter had crossed that ridge. She was not afraid of the process. She was not afraid of the questions. She realized afraid of something smaller and more specific. The moment when someone in that process asked her to reduce what she had done to a category that fit their existing framework. The moment when the review, the same kind of review that had happened 2 years ago, the same structure, the same language, tried to put a name on what Ghost was and got it wrong. "Mason," she said, "when we debrief." "Yeah, don't." She stopped, started again. "Just tell them what happened, exactly what happened. Don't explain it. Don't contextualize it. Don't make it," she paused, "don't make it make sense in a way that makes it smaller." He looked at her for a long moment. The IV was still running. His color was continuing to improve, and she was in the quiet way she handled relief, grateful for that. "What do you want me to say when they ask who took the shot?" he said. She looked at the rifle in her lap. She thought about the name on the roster that no longer existed. the designation that had been erased, the classified incident that had produced a documentation trail leading to a different identity, a different role, a different official version of who she was. She thought about the shot, 1,140 meters, drifted scope, 20-knot crosswind, -14, a moving armored vehicle, a 15-second calibration window, 1 round. She thought about Marcus Webb's paperback novels still in his left cargo pocket, somewhere on a mountain she had just left. She thought about Mason Reed bleeding into the snow and choosing with the clarity of someone who had run out of everything except will to stay present anyway. She looked at the rifle. "Tell them the truth," she said. Mason nodded. He already knew what the truth was. He'd known it since the moment she'd come up behind the Barrett and realized it was jammed and reached for the MK-14 without hesitation, without a word, without the performance of someone stepping into a role they weren't supposed to fill. He'd known it since she'd made the calibration shot and read the drift in 4 seconds and rebuilt the ballistic solution in her head, while he was feeding her wind data through blood loss and cold that would have put most people into a different category of consciousness entirely. He'd known it since she stood up on that ridge. The helicopter crossed the perimeter of FOB Kestrel and flared for landing, and the ground came up to meet them. And the rotors began winding down, and through the open door, she could see people moving toward the aircraft. Medical personnel, a base security element, and further back in the specific posture of someone who has been waiting and is now composing themselves to stop waiting, a figure she recognized as the intelligence officer who ran the debrief process at Kestrel. The questions were coming. She was ready for the questions. She checked the MK-14 one final time, force of habit, the weapon always cleared before you cross a threshold, before you leave a vehicle, before you enter a structure. She cleared it with the efficiency of something done 10,000 times. Removed the magazine, checked the chamber, seated the mag, safe. She stepped out of the helicopter. The cold hit her again. Kestrel's cold, lower altitude than the ridge, maybe 5 degrees warmer, which was the difference between barely survivable and merely brutal. She stood on the landing pad and looked back briefly at the northwest ridgeline she'd come from. The mountain was still there. Of course it was. Mountains did not change because of what happened on them. But she had changed. Or more precisely, she had stopped pretending she hadn't. The intelligence officer was walking toward her. Behind him, she could hear Mason's stretcher being offloaded, the flight medic handing off to the base medical team, voices using the clipped, information-dense language of trauma handoff. She tracked that conversation in her peripheral awareness, tourniquet, time estimated, and blood loss EV, access, vitals en route, and registered that Mason's prognosis based on what she was hearing was what she had assessed it to be serious survivable, requiring surgery that this FOB could initiate and a higher-level facility could complete. He was going to be all right. The intelligence officer reached her. He was a major. She knew him as Reyes, a compact, precise man who ran debrief with the methodical thoroughness of someone who believed that every piece of information had value if you could figure out what question it answered. He looked at her with the expression of a person who has received fragmented radio communications and is now looking at the source material. "Carter," he said, "Major. We lost comms for," he checked something in his hand, a tablet. 2 hours and 19 minutes. We've been working with partial information since the blackout. "I know. The convoy is stopped. We're confirming that from overhead imagery." He paused. "1 vehicle destroyed, engine block. High right side. The asset that made that engagement." He stopped. He looked at her, at the MK-14 in her hands, at the cleared, secured, carefully maintained rifle she had not put down since she came off the hoist. "Carter, your designation on this mission is 68W. "Yes, sir." 68W doesn't carry a long rifle. She met his eyes. "MK-14 is within the authorized equipment list for my mission loadout, sir. I qualified on it before my designation change." He looked at her for another moment. The look of a man who is adding information to a calculation he's been working on since the helicopter landed. "Who made the shot?" She thought about what she'd told Mason. Tell them the truth. Exactly what happened. "I did," she said. "Ghost did." Major Reyes was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said with the careful neutrality of someone who is going to need to write a very specific kind of report, "Come with me." We need to start the debrief immediately. She followed him toward the main structure, and behind her, she heard one of the medical personnel say something to another. She caught only the last three words carried on the cold air. 1,100 meters. She kept walking. The mountain was still behind her. Ghost was still with her. Both of those things were true, and for the first time in 2 years, she was not going to pretend they weren't. The debrief room at FOB Kestrel was not designed for comfort, and Major Reyes had never once apologized for that. It was a functional space. A table chairs, a recording system mounted in the corner, and a wall-mounted display that could pull overhead imagery, signal intercepts, and mission documentation with equal efficiency. The room smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long, and the particular institutional sterility of a space that processed difficult information on a regular basis and had stopped being affected by the weight of it. Ava had been in rooms like this before. She had never been in one carrying quite this much. Reyes set his tablet on the table and pulled a chair across from her without ceremony. He sat the way he always sat, straight, economical, the posture of a man who did not waste physical space any more than he wasted words. On the table between them was a voice recorder already running. She noted the red light without comment. 0614, he said, reading the time off the tablet. Post-mission debrief. Carter Ava Staff Sergeant, 68W FOB Kestrel. Reyes D. Major Intelligence conducting. He looked up at her. Start from the beginning, not from the contact, from departure. She started from the beginning. She told it the way she told everything in sequence, without editorializing, with the precision of someone who understood that the value of a brief was in the accuracy of the account and not the impressiveness of the story. She told him about the departure from Kestrel at 0200 hours with a 3-person team, herself, Mason Reed, and Marcus Webb. She told him about the route to the ridge position, the 6-hour movement that had gone without incident until it hadn't. She told him about the comms blackout, which had begun at approximately 0347 and had not resolved during the mission window. She told him about the first contact, the engagement that had taken Marcus Webb out of the picture at 0412, the 11 minutes of radio silence that had followed the decision to hold position and continue the observation mission rather than withdraw without comms. Reyes was writing, not on the tablet, on paper in a small notebook he'd produced from a breast pocket. She noted that too. People who write on paper during debriefs do so because they want a record that doesn't exist on a server that other people can access. She filed that observation and kept talking. When she reached the enemy sniper's shot, the round that had caught Mason high on the outer thigh at 0431, Reyes held up a hand. Stop there. You identified the shot as intentional, non-lethal. Yes. Explain your basis for that assessment. Entry angle and tissue location. The round entered from a position that indicated a shot taken from a higher elevation consistent with the Sector 340 position I subsequently identified. At that angle and distance, a shooter targeting the thoracic cavity or the head would have produced a dramatically different point of entry. The thigh shot at that angle required a deliberate downward correction from the natural aiming point. You don't accidentally shoot someone in the thigh when you're aiming for the body. Not at 600 meters with a shooter of that skill level. Reyes wrote something. And you believe the intention was to disable rather than kill. I believe the intention was to create a specific tactical situation. A dead team member can be managed quickly. The remaining personnel adapt and continue or withdraw. A critically wounded team member requires constant attention, limits mobility, and anchors the team to a position. If you're trying to freeze a reconnaissance element in place, you wound one of them in a way that demands active care. Then you wait. Wait for what? For the convoy. He looked up from the notebook. Something had shifted in his expression. The professional neutrality was still there, but underneath it, something had engaged some intelligence mechanism that was running faster than the official process. You're saying the sniper knew about the convoy. I'm saying the timing is not coincidental. The convoy entered the corridor at 0517. The sniper's shot came at 0431. That's 46 minutes. Enough time to wound the team, allow the wound management to consume the medic's attention and mobility, confirm the comms blackout was holding, and then begin the convoy movement with the reasonable expectation that there was no functional long-range threat on that ridge. She paused. Except there was. Reyes set his pen down, not dramatically, just set it down the way you set something down when your hands need to be free for thinking. Carter, that's a sophisticated assessment. That implies coordination between the sniper and the convoy command element. Yes. Which implies intelligence about your team's position. Yes. Which implies he stopped himself. She watched him stop himself, watched him reach the edge of something and pull back from it with the discipline of someone who knows that the edge is real, and going over it in a debrief room without more information is not useful. He picked up the pen. Continue. She continued. She told him about the Barrett, the jam, the assessment that the feed mechanism was non-functional. She told him about identifying the MK14 as the secondary option and the immediate problem of the drifted scope. She told him about Mason's condition. At that point, blood loss, ongoing tourniquet applied, conscious and functional but operating on reserves. She told him about the calibration shot, the reference rock, the frozen shrub cluster, the 18-centimeter impact offset that had given her the drift measurement. He stopped her again. You calibrated a scope under field conditions. I took a calibration shot to establish the drift magnitude and direction. Then I applied a manual correction. Using what tools? Arithmetic. He stared at her. It was the most unguarded expression she had seen from Reyes in 6 months of working under his intelligence umbrella, and it lasted approximately 2 seconds before the professional composure reasserted itself. In the target engagement, 1,140 meters, moving MRAP engine block, 18 to 20 knot crosswind left to right, minus 14 degrees Celsius, scope drift correction 26 centimeters right, wind drift correction approximately 93 centimeters right, target lead 30 centimeters, single round 7.62 NATO, 175 grain match. Single round, he repeated, single round. He wrote for a moment without speaking. The recorder's red light was steady in the corner. Outside the room, she could hear the bass doing what basses did, movement voices, the background machinery of a functioning military installation. Somewhere in the medical facility on the other side of the base, Mason Reed was in surgery. She knew this without being told. The timeline from tourniquet to surgical intervention was something she'd been running in her head since the helicopter landed. And the number said surgery would have started approximately 20 minutes ago. She was not going to think about that right now. Carter, Reyes leaned forward slightly, just slightly. The lean of a man who is about to ask the question he actually came here to ask, having spent the first 40 minutes of the debrief establishing the foundation to ask it on. Your official designation on this mission was 68W Combat Medic. Yes, sir. The MK14 was in your mission loadout. Within authorized equipment parameters, yes, sir. You've been on 11 missions out of Kestrel in the last 6 months, all designated 68W, all with long rifle in your loadout. He paused. I've reviewed those mission reports. The MK14 appears in your equipment manifest on 8 of those missions. You have never fired it in an official capacity. She said nothing. Carter, I'm not building a case against you. I need you to understand that. He held her gaze. But I am trying to understand what I'm looking at, because what I'm looking at does not fit the file I have for you. What file do you have for me? The official one. He paused. And I am beginning to suspect the official one is incomplete. She breathed, slowly through the nose with the deliberate composure of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for 2 years and is now deciding in real time how much of the truth to hand to a man she trusted professionally but could not control institutionally. She made a decision. The incident, she said, 2 years ago. You've read the board's report. I've read what's in the file. Then you know what they concluded. I know what they concluded. I'd like to know what happened. She told him. Not the version she'd told at Mason on the Ridge, not the pared-down blood loss management version designed to keep a wounded man's mind engaged. The full version. The role player who wasn't in the brief. The timeline discrepancy that the documentation hadn't cleanly resolved. The board's conclusion and the basis for it. The designation change. The 2 years of being both things at once, medic and ghost, healer and shooter, without the institutional acknowledgement that both were real. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for a long moment. The fourth role player, and he said, was not in the engagement zone during my pre-fire assessment. He entered it during the window. And you couldn't prove that from the documentation. The exercise clock timestamps were ambiguous. The board gave weight to the less favorable interpretation. Because she met his eyes. Because an 11-inch miss is terrifying regardless of whose fault it was. And it's easier to change one person's file than to acknowledge a systemic documentation failure in a high-profile qualification course. She paused. That's not a complaint. That's an assessment. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He closed the notebook, left it closed, and he reached across the table and pressed the stop button on the recorder. The red light went out. She did not change her expression. She did not show the alarm that moved through her in the moment the recorder stopped, the particular alarm of someone who has been trained to understand that off-record conversations in official settings are not neutral acts. I'm going to tell you something, Reyes said, and it's going to stay in this room until I determine what to do with it. She waited. The convoy you stopped today was not a training exercise element. She had known this. She had known it the way you know things you can't officially know, through the accumulation of small signals that don't add up to the scenario you've been briefed on, the irregular spacing of the vehicles, the command element positioned at the rear, the coordination between the sniper and the convoy timing, the sophistication of the tactical situation that had been built around her team. But hearing it confirmed was different from knowing it. Tell me, she said. The MR app you destroyed, the one you killed the engine on at 1,100 meters, was carrying something. We've been trying to confirm what for 6 weeks. The convoy was a transfer operation. The destination was a position 40 kilometers north of the corridor that we've been watching for 3 months. He paused. Carter, that convoy doesn't stop whatever they're moving, gets to that position, and we lose the intelligence window we've been building toward since February. She held very still. You knew the convoy was coming. We knew it was probable. We didn't know the timeline. But the mission, she stopped, rearranged. The mission brief said reconnaissance, observation and reporting, no engagement criteria. The mission brief reflected what command could authorize at the planning stage. With comms down without confirmation of the convoy's identity, the engagement decision, he paused. The engagement decision was yours. Made under field conditions, without command authorization, with incomplete information. And if I'd been wrong, if that had been a training element, a civilian contractor, convoy, anything other than what you're telling me, it was, then we'd be having a very different conversation. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, the thing that lived on the other side of the shot, not just the physics, not just the ballistics, not just the 1,140 meters, and the drifted scope and the 20-knot crosswind. The decision, the unsupported, unauthorized, irreversible decision made by a woman who was officially a medic on a mountain with no comms and a wounded spotter in 90 seconds. What was it carrying, she asked. The MRAP. Reyes looked at her. That's above your current clearance level. I stopped it. You did. I think that earns an answer. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then personnel. 3 individuals, non-military, being transported under armed escort to the northern position. Based on signals intelligence from the past 72 hours, we believe those individuals were being moved for purposes related to the communications infrastructure that's been disrupting this sector's operational capacity for the last 9 days. The communications infrastructure, the comms blackout, the interference that had killed her radio, her beacon, her ability to call for help for 2 hours and 19 minutes. The convoy was related to why we had no comms, she said. Not a question. We believe so. They built the blackout to protect the convoy. That's our current assessment. She breathed. The architecture of it was becoming visible, the whole thing, not just the tactical surface, but the operational structure beneath it. The blackout hadn't been incidental to the convoy. The convoy was why the blackout existed. The sniper hadn't been protecting the convoy from a team that happened to be in position. The team had been identified, isolated, and systematically reduced comms, killed 1 member, eliminated 1 wounded. The designated long-range capability jammed as a specific protective measure for a specific movement on a specific timeline. They had known the team was there. Major, her voice was very level. They knew our position before we established it. Reyes said nothing, which was his own kind of answer. The insertion route, the ridge position, they knew we were coming. Carter, that's not operational speculation. If the sniper was in position at Sector 340 when we arrived, and he had to have been given the timing of the first contact, he was pre-staged. You don't get pre-staged at 600 meters from a target position without knowing that position in advance. She felt something move through her, cold and focused, and entirely different from the cold of the ridge. We had a leak before this mission. Someone knew where we were going. Reyes picked up his pen. He opened the notebook. And then he wrote something that she couldn't read upside down from her position, and he looked up at her and said, "That is why this debrief does not leave this room until I say so." She stared at him. Marcus Webb. Carter. Marcus Webb is dead. If there was a leak, if someone compromised this mission before it launched, Marcus Webb is dead because of that. I need to know if that's what happened. Reyes met her eyes. His expression was doing something complicated, the negotiation between what he was authorized to share and what the human being across the table from him needed to hear. She watched that negotiation happen and watched it resolve in her favor. Not out of softness, out of a calculation that she deserved the answer. "We don't know yet," he said. "That is the truth. We do not know yet. What we do know is that the situation on that ridge was more prepared for your team's presence than a coincidental contact explains. The investigation into that is open. It started," he checked the tablet, "41 minutes ago, before the helicopter landed. Before the helicopter landed." She absorbed this. Someone at Kestrel or connected to Kestrel or with access to Kestrel's mission planning had put her team in a prepared trap. Marcus Webb had walked into that trap and not come back. Mason Reed had bled into the snow inside that trap. She had shot her way out of it with a drifted scope and a coin and whatever lived inside her that refused to accept the word impossible as a final answer. And the investigation had started 41 minutes ago, which meant someone had been watching the tactical picture closely enough to identify the anomaly while she was still on the mountain. "Who started the investigation?" she asked. "I did," Reyes said. She looked at him, really looked at him. Not the professional assessment she ran on everyone the surface read of posture and expression and behavioral tell. A deeper look. The look you give someone when you are deciding whether they are the last line of your trust. "You knew something was wrong before we launched," she said. He didn't answer. "Major, you knew something was off about this mission before it launched." "I had a concern," he said carefully. "A signals anomaly. Something that suggested the communications blackout in this sector was not random equipment failure. I brought it up through channels at 2100 hours last night. I was told it was being addressed." He paused. "Your team launched at 0200. So you raised a flag and Command launched us anyway." "Command launched you anyway." The room was very quiet. She thought about that, about the 6-hour movement through cold and dark and rough terrain, 3 people who trusted each other and trusted the intelligence that had sent them there. About Marcus Webb's paperback novel in his left cargo pocket, and the Sunday phone calls from his mother, and the 26 years of a life that had ended somewhere on a mountain because someone had made a decision at 2100 hours to launch a mission into a prepared kill zone. She felt rage. Real rage, not the tactical clarity she'd been operating in for the last 6 hours, but actual human rage, the kind that had heat in it and nowhere immediate to go. She felt it arrive register, and then she did what she had done with every difficult feeling that had come up in this room. She put it somewhere she could reach it later when it would be useful rather than expensive. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I write a report that accurately reflects this debrief. Now the investigation into the mission compromise moves forward under appropriate authority. Now you," he paused. "Now you are going to be asked some questions by people above my pay grade, and I am going to suggest as strongly as I am able to suggest anything that you have an advocate present when that happens." An advocate. A JAG officer, someone who knows military law and is specifically on your side. He held her gaze. "Because Carter, what you did today is either the most important thing that's happened in this sector in 3 months, or it's an unauthorized engagement by a combat medic who exceeded her designated role under field conditions. Which version it becomes depends significantly on what the investigation finds and who is telling the story." She looked at him steadily. "You're telling me to protect myself. I'm telling you the system is not always the same thing as justice, and that knowing the difference in advance it is better than learning it afterward." He stood. "I'm going to get you water and something to eat. You've been on that ridge for 6 hours and you've been in this room for 47 minutes and you haven't asked for either, which tells me you're running on discipline rather than reserves. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Carter. She looked up. The shot. At 1,140 meters, drifted scope 20-knot crosswind moving target, single round. He paused. In 18 years of intelligence work, I have seen 3 confirmed shots in that difficulty range. None of them were made under conditions that were anything like what you were operating in today. He paused again. Longer. I need you to know that I know what you did today, regardless of what any report says. He left. She sat in the empty debrief room and looked at the wall and let herself feel the full weight of the last 6 hours for exactly 45 seconds. She counted them. Not because she was suppressing anything, because she was allowing something, and allowing it was not the same as being consumed by it, and knowing the difference was what had kept her functional on that ridge when everything else was failing. Marcus Webb, the leak, the trap, Mason and surgery, the shot, the bluff on the ridge, Ghost, the name that had been erased and had apparently never agreed to stay erased. She let all of it be real for 45 seconds. Then she picked up the MK-14 from where she'd set it against the table leg, checked it once more out of pure habit, and set it across her lap. The door opened. Not Reyes, a young specialist she didn't know carrying a bottle of water and a packaged meal that was the military's idea of food and would taste like nothing in particular and contain everything her body currently needed. She took both without comment. "Ma'am," the specialist said, "Corporal Reed is out of surgery. He's in recovery. The surgeon says he's stable." She closed her eyes, just for a moment, just for the length of one breath in and one breath out. "Thank you," she said. The specialist left. She opened the water, drank half of it in 4 swallows, set it down and looked at the recorder in the corner, with the red light still off, still dark. Reyes's decision to stop the official record, still sitting in the room like a third presence. She thought about what he'd said. Which version it becomes depends on who is telling the story. She had spent 2 years letting other people tell the story. That was done now. She ate. She drank the rest of the water. She sat in the empty room with the MK-14 across her lap and waited for what came next with the specific patience of someone who has already been through the worst of it and knows from experience that knowing you've survived the worst is its own kind of armor. Through the wall, somewhere in the base, a door opened and closed. Voices, movement, the machinery of investigation beginning to turn somewhere above her pay grade in rooms she hadn't been invited into yet. She waited. Ghost waited. Both of them ready. They came for her 3 hours after the debrief ended. Not Reyes. 2 people she didn't recognize. A lieutenant colonel named Hargrove and a civilian whose identification badge read Defense Intelligence Agency in letters that were meant to project authority and succeeded. They came into the debrief room without knocking, which told her something about how they understood the power structure of this conversation. And they sat down across from her with the specific body language of people who believed they were managing a situation rather than participating in one. She had finished the packaged meal. She had drunk 2 more bottles of water. She had sat with the MK-14 across her lap for 3 hours and thought through everything she knew and everything she suspected and everything she was prepared to say and not say. And by the time Hargrove and the DIA man walked through the door, she was the most prepared she had been for anything since she'd settled behind the rifle on the ridge that morning. Staff Sergeant Carter, Hargrove said. He had the clipped efficiency of someone who had delivered difficult news to many people and had developed a method for it. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove. This is Special Agent Doran from DIA. We're here to conduct a secondary review of this morning's incident." "Incident," she said. "Not a challenge, an observation." Hargrove registered it. "The engagement." "That's accurate." Doran set a tablet on the table. He had the tablet angled so she couldn't read it, which was a choice. "Staff Sergeant, we've reviewed Major Reyes' preliminary debrief notes. We have some follow-up questions." "I was told I could have a JAG officer present." Doran looked up. "Who told you that?" "Major Reyes." A brief exchange of glances between the 2 men. The kind of exchange that happens when someone has done something that wasn't in the plan. "You're not under any formal charge, Staff Sergeant. This is an informational review." Then I'm happy to have an informational conversation with a JAG officer present. Hargrove leaned forward. Carter, I understand the instinct to protect yourself, but I want to be direct with you. The faster we can establish a clean account of what happened today, the better the outcome for everyone involved. She looked at him steadily. He was not a dishonest man. She could read that. He genuinely believed what he was saying. He also genuinely believed that a clean account meant an account that fit upon the existing framework without requiring the framework to change. Those two beliefs were not always compatible, and she suspected he hadn't fully examined the place where they came apart. Lieutenant Colonel, she said, I've given a complete account of this morning's events to Major Reyes. That account is accurate, and I'll stand behind every word of it. I'll give the same account to you in the same room with the same accuracy. She paused, with a JAG officer present. Hargrove sat back. Something had shifted in his assessment of her. She could see it. He had come in expecting someone depleted. 6 hours on a mountain, a wounded team, a dead teammate extraction under fire. He had expected someone who would take the path of least resistance because the path of least resistance would feel in the moment like rest. He had gotten something different. Give us a moment, he said. They stepped outside. She sat with the MK-14 and waited. 14 minutes later, the door opened again. Hargrove Doran, in a captain in JAG uniform, who introduced herself as Captain Okafor, and shook Ava's hand with the firm, direct grip of someone who had sized up the situation in the hallway and arrived in the room already on her side. I'm briefed on the basics, Okafor said quietly, leaning toward her before Hargrove could restart the official proceedings. Don't answer anything you're not certain about. If you're uncertain, say so. If a question has a premise you disagree with, say so before you answer. She paused. You did something extraordinary today. Make sure the record reflects that accurately. Ava looked at her. Thank you, Captain. Okafor sat beside her. Hargrove restarted the recording. The questions came methodically. Hargrove asked them in the order of someone building a timeline. Departure movement, first contact, Marcus Webb's last confirmed communication, the comms blackout, the enemy sniper, Mason's wound, the Barrett, the MK-14, the calibration, the shot. She answered each one with the same precision she'd brought to Reyes's questions, and Okafor watched the process with the attentiveness of someone waiting for the specific question that would require intervention. It came 40 minutes in. Doran, who had been largely quiet, leaned forward and said, Staff Sergeant Carter, your official designation on this mission was 6-8W Combat Medic. Your primary operational role was medical support to the reconnaissance element. Is that correct? That is my current official designation. Yes. And in your assessment, did the engagement you conducted this morning fall within the parameters of that designation? Okafor put her hand flat on the table, not touching Ava, just a presence, a signal. Staff Sergeant Carter, before you answer that, I'd like to establish the framework. Special Agent Doran, and are you asking whether the engagement was legally authorized under the rules of engagement for this mission, or are you asking whether it fell within the scope of Staff Sergeant Carter's medical MOS? Doran paused. Both. Those are two separate questions, and they have two separate answers. Which would you like first? Another glance between Hargrove and Doran. Ava watched them recalibrate. Okafor had done something efficient and precise. She had identified the compound question that was designed to produce a single answer covering two distinct legal territories, and she had separated them before that answer could be given. It was Ava thought exactly what good precision looked like in a domain that wasn't ballistics. Rules of engagement first, Hargrove said. Okafor nodded at Ava. The rules of engagement for this mission authorized engagement of hostile forces that presented an immediate threat to the team or to the successful completion of the mission objective, Ava said. The convoy represented a direct threat to both to the team through the coordinated hostile action that had already wounded one member and eliminated another, and to the mission objective, which was reconnaissance and disruption of enemy supply movement through the corridor. Under those ROE parameters, the engagement was authorized. The mission brief specified observation and reporting, Doran said, not interdiction. The mission brief was written before the comms blackout that prevented reporting. Once reporting became impossible, observation without interdiction produced zero operational value. The ROE did not require me to watch an enemy convoy complete its movement because the reporting mechanism had been deliberately disabled. She kept her voice completely level. Had comms been functional, I would have reported the convoy's position and composition and waited for an engagement authorization from command. Comms were not functional. The engagement decision fell to the ranking functional member of the team on the ground. Which was you. Which was me. Hargrove wrote something. Doran looked at his tablet. Okafor looked at neither of them. Staff Sergeant Carter, Doran said, I want to ask you about something Major Reyes documented in his preliminary notes. He paused. The pause was deliberate, the kind that precedes something designed to land with weight. He notes that you raised during the debrief the possibility that this mission was compromised prior to launch, that the enemy's pre-stage position suggested advanced knowledge of your team's route and objective. Yes, that's a serious allegation. It's an assessment based on tactical evidence. Walk me through that assessment. She walked him through it. The same logic she'd laid out for Reyes, the sniper's pre-staged position, the timing of the comms blackout relative to the convoy movement, the coordinated nature of the attack on her team. She watched Doran's face as she spoke, and she saw the thing she had expected to see, not surprise, but recognition. The expression of someone hearing confirmation of something they already suspected. He already knew. She was certain of it in the moment she saw that expression. DIA had been working this thread before she came down from the mountain. Special Agent Doran, she said when she had finished the assessment, you already have a line on this. He looked up. You came in here with a tablet you've been keeping angled away from me since you sat down. You've been asking questions about the mission compromise with the specific sequencing of someone confirming details rather than discovering them. You know something about the leak. She held his gaze. Marcus Webb is dead. Mason Reed almost died. I have a right to know if you know why. Hargrove said Carter. She's correct, Doran said, flat quiet with the tone of someone making a decision in real time. Hargrove looked at him sharply. Lieutenant Colonel, she was on the mountain. She's the primary witness to the tactical situation. If our assessment of the compromised source is accurate, she's also a potential target for whoever authorized it. She has a right to the operational picture. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, continue. Doran turned the tablet around. She looked at it, a photograph. A man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, civilian clothing, unremarkable face. Below the photograph, a name and an organizational affiliation that she read twice because the first reading produced a result she had to verify. The organizational affiliation was FOB Kestrel, Logistics Section, a contractor who had been on the base for 4 months and had access through his contract scope to mission planning documents, insertion route selections, and operational scheduling. We've been watching him for 6 weeks, Doran said. He's been passing information on mission timelines and routes to a network we've been building a case against since February. Last night's mission was the third one he compromised. The first 2 didn't result in contact. This one, he stopped. This one had a better team waiting, she said. Yes. Marcus Webb died because this man told someone we were coming. Doran said nothing, which was the most honest answer available. She looked at the photograph for exactly as long as she needed to. She committed the face to memory with the same precise attention she brought to range cards and WEN data. Not because she was planning anything, because she needed to know the face of the decision that had killed Marcus Webb. She needed it to be real and specific and attached to a human being rather than floating as an abstraction in the architecture of the event. Then she looked up. Has he been detained? She asked. As of 40 minutes ago, Doran said. She breathed. Good. The room was quiet for a moment. Hargrove was looking at his notes. Okafor was watching Ava with an expression that was carefully professional and contained underneath the professionalism something that might have been respect. Doran had turned the tablet back to his side of the table. Then Hargrove said the thing she hadn't expected. Carter, I want to address the designation issue. She went still. Your current official file lists you as 68WW, the classification review that produced that designation 2 years ago. I've read it. He paused. I've also had access through this investigation to some materials that were not part of the original board's review, specifically exercise clock data from the qualification course event that the board cited as the basis for their findings. He set his pen down. The timestamp discrepancy you described to Major Reyes, the timing of the fourth role player's entry into the engagement zone is documentable. The data existed. It was not included in the board's review package. She sat very still. Why not? We're still determining that. It may have been an administrative error. It may have been something else. He met her eyes. But I want you to know that the investigation that started 41 minutes before your helicopter landed is not only about the mission compromise. It is also about the documentation of the events 2 years ago that led to your current designation. The room was absolutely silent. Ava did not move. She did not change her expression. She sat with the MK-14 across her lap and the weight of what Hargrove had just said settling into her, with the slow, enormous gravity of something that had been pressing against the door for 2 years and had just been given permission to come through it. The timestamp data was available, she said. It was available. The board didn't use it. The board didn't use it, she breathed. 1 breath, 2. Marcus Webb is dead because a contractor sold our route. I spent 2 years carrying a designation that was wrong because someone didn't include a timestamp in a review package. She kept her voice level. It cost her something she couldn't measure. I'm trying to determine if those two things are connected or if I'm looking for a pattern that isn't there. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. That is a question the investigation will answer. How long? Weeks, possibly months. And in the meantime? In the meantime, he said, I am recommending effective immediately a provisional restoration of your primary designation pending review outcome. That recommendation goes to the commanding general today. He paused. It is a recommendation, not a certainty, but it is mine and I intend to make it forcefully. Okafor beside her let out a quiet breath, the kind of breath that is not dramatic, but is absolutely real. Ava said nothing for a moment. She looked at the table. She thought about 2 years of carrying both things at once, the rifle and the medical kit, the identity that had been erased and the one that had replaced it, Ghost and the medic, and she thought about the way the mountain had made the question irrelevant. The mountain had not cared what her file said. The ridge had not required her to choose between her designations. The shot had not asked permission from a review board. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel, she said. Don't thank me. The shot earned it. He stood. You're dismissed. Get some rest. Medical has cleared you for quarters. He paused at the door. Carter, for what it's worth, and I recognize it doesn't cover what it costs. What you did on that ridge today mattered, not just tactically. It mattered. He left. Doran followed. Okafor stayed. How are you doing? Okafor asked. Not professionally, person to person. Ova looked at her. I need to see Mason. He's in recovery. They'll allow a short visit. Okafor stood. I'll walk you over. They walked through to the base in the gray, late afternoon light. The cold less absolute at this altitude than it had been on the ridge, but still present, still making itself known. Ava carried the MK-14 because she had not put it down since coming off the hoist, and she was not going to start now. Okafor walked beside her and did not try to fill the silence, which was the correct instinct. The medical facility was warm in the way that institutional buildings are warm, aggressively, uniformly, without nuance. It smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, in the particular underlying scent of a place where the body's failures and recoveries happen simultaneously on a continuous basis. She had spent significant time in places like this on both sides of the threshold. She navigated it without needing direction, turned left, past the nurse's station, right past the trauma bay, through the double doors into recovery. Mason was in the second bay. He was awake. She knew he would be. Mason Reed woke up from anesthesia the way he did most things, with an alertness that preceded full physical function. The mind arriving before the body was ready to support it. His eyes were open and tracking when she came through the door, and when he saw her, something in his face did the thing that faces do when a wait ends. You still have the rifle, he said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia tube, slightly slower than his normal cadence, but present, entirely present. I always have the rifle. They let you walk around the base with a long gun. Nobody stopped me. He almost laughed. It became a wince that he managed with the practiced grace of someone who was learning the new geography of his pain. How'd the debrief go? She pulled a chair to the side of his bed and sat down. She set the MK-14 against the wall within reach, within sight. And then she told him, Not everything, not the investigation details that carried classification weight. She wasn't authorized to transfer in a recovery bay. But the shape of it, Hargrove's recommendation, the timestamp data, the contractor in logistics, the investigation that was now open and moving. He listened without interrupting, which was how Mason Reed listened to important things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The timestamp was always there, he said. It was always there. 2 years and it was sitting in a data file somewhere. Yes. He breathed slowly, carefully, managing the expansion of his chest against whatever the surgery had rearranged in his midsection. Does that make you angry? She considered the question with genuine attention. The rage she had felt in the debrief room, real hot human, was still there, but it had changed shape since the conversation with Hargrove. It had moved from the unfocused, nowhere-to-go rage of injustice into something more directed, more purposeful. The rage was becoming information, the way pain became information when you let it tell you where the injury was, instead of just screaming about it. Yes, she said, but not in a way I can't use. He looked at her. That is the most you thing you have ever said. She almost smiled. Mason, Marcus. His face changed. She watched it change, the alertness, staying, the composure staying, but something underneath both of those shifting. The movement of grief that was just beginning to arrive now that the immediate crisis had passed and there was space for it. Yeah, he said quietly. He had a novel in his cargo pocket. I never asked him what it was. It was Lonesome Dove, Mason said. He'd been reading it since June. Said it was the kind of book you had to read slow or you'd use it up too fast. He paused. He was on his third time through. She sat with that. Lonesome Dove. Marcus Webb reading it slow so he wouldn't use it up too fast. She added it to what she knew about him, the sister named Deja, the Sunday calls the card game skill, the 26 years, and she let it be real and specific and irreducible. His family is going to get a notification today, she said, if they haven't already. I know. I'm going to write a letter to his mother. She paused. When I know more about what happened, about why, I'm going to write a letter that tells her the truth about her son's last day. Not the official version, the real one. She looked at Mason. He went into that contact without hesitation. Whatever happened in those 11 minutes, he didn't hesitate going in. No, Mason said. He never hesitated. They sat in the quiet of the recovery bay for a moment. Outside the room, the base continued its machinery. Inside, the two of them held the weight of the day with the specific shared gravity of people who had been through the same fire and come out on the other side of it, changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. They're going to restore your designation, Mason said, not a question. Hargrove is recommending it. It's not certain. It'll happen. His voice was certain in the way that people are certain about things they simply know, rather than things they've calculated. And when it does, he stopped. When it does what? When it does, I'm going to need a new spotter card because the one I've been carrying lists my shooter as a 68W and that is going to require some updating. He met her eyes. If you'll have me. She looked at him. The IV still in his arm, the surgical dressing under the hospital gown, the face of a man who had fed her wind data through blood loss and cold and had said, I'm here when she needed him to be there and had held on for the full extraction window on the strength of a promise he'd made to himself on a frozen ridge. I'll have you, she said. He nodded. Then with the careful economy of someone managing a new and complicated relationship with pain, he shifted slightly in the bed and said, Go get some sleep, Ava. You've been awake for 22 hours. Go sleep. I need to do one thing first. He looked at her. The armory, she said. I need to re-zero the MK-14 properly. With actual equipment, verify the correction I built in the field. He was quiet for a moment. At 22 hours awake. The scope needs to be verified. If the correction I calculated under field conditions was off, if the round hit the engine block because I got lucky, rather than because the math was right, I need to know that. And if the math was right, I need to confirm it. She paused. I need to know which one it was. He looked at her for a long moment. What if it was both? She picked up the MK-14. Then I need to know that too. She left him there and walked to the armory. The armory at FOB Kestrel operated on a 24-hour basis it had to given the operational tempo of the installation. The armorer on night shift was a sergeant named Dillard, who had been at Kestrel for 14 months and who, when Ava came through the door with the MK-14 and explained what she needed, looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard the story from 3 different sources already and is now meeting the primary source in person. He gave her a bench. He gave her a bore sight, a set of calibrated tools, the complete night force adjustment documentation for the scope model, and the specific kind of respectful distance that professionals extend to other professionals who are working. She worked in silence. The verification process was methodical. She removed the scope from the rifle, examined the external housing for the impact damage she already knew was there. A slight deformation on the left side ring, consistent with the fall she'd taken going to ground after the enemy sniper's shot. She documented the deformation. Then she remounted the scope, bore-sighted the system, and used the Armory's laser system to establish a precise baseline 0 against the facility's internal target system. The result appeared on the screen after 4 minutes of measurement. She looked at it. The scope had drifted 17.4 centimeters to the right of 0. She had calculated 18 centimeters from her field calibration shot at 800 meters and applied a proportional correction for 1,140 meters that had produced a working correction of 26 centimeters. The precise value calculated with Armory equipment was 25.8 centimeters. She had been off by 0.2 of a centimeter. At 1,140 meters, 0.2 of a centimeter of scope correction error produced a terminal impact deviation of approximately 2 centimeters. Factoring in the other variables, wind drift correction, target lead, the compound error of the field calibration versus the precise calibration was somewhere between 3 and 4 centimeters of terminal deviation. 3 to 4 centimeters. On a target, she had been aiming for the center right of the engine block, specifically the cooling system. Specifically the upper portion of it, 3 to 4 centimeters of deviation left the round comfortably within the effective impact zone. The shot had been good because the math had been right. Not lucky, right. The field calibration under impossible conditions, with a spent casing and a coin and 11 minutes of window, had produced a correction that was accurate to within 0.2 of a centimeter. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it meant. Not tactically, she knew what it meant tactically. She thought about what it meant about the thing she had been told she was too dangerous to be, the thing the review board had decided was a liability, the precision, the capacity to hold multiple complex calculations simultaneously in a kind of internal suspension and produce accurate solutions under conditions that were designed to make accurate solutions impossible. It wasn't a liability. It had never been a liability. It was the most precise, most reliable, most controlled thing about her, and the system had tried to call it dangerous because it exceeded what the system's framework could comfortably contain. She re-zeroed the scope properly, fully, using the Armory's equipment in the precise measurements in the complete adjustment protocol. When she finished, the system was zeroed to a standard that would satisfy any Armory inspection on any installation. She logged the work in the Armory record, signed her name, her actual name, not her call sign, because the log was official documentation, and official documentation was the territory she was reclaiming one piece at a time. Dillard came by as she was finishing. He looked at the log entry, at the scope data, at the re-zero documentation. Field calibration was off by 0.2, he said. Yes. At 1,100 meters. Yes. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone adding information to a framework that is still being built. That's Staff Sergeant, that's inside the margin of error for controlled range conditions. You produced a field calibration inside controlled range error. He paused. In the conditions they're saying you were in. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'm putting this in the equipment log as a verified field calibration event. For the record. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I want it in the record, he said. What happened today should be in the record. She thought about Hargrove saying the shot earned it. She thought about Reyes saying, I need you to know that I know what you did today. She thought about Okafor's grip, Dillard's Armory log, Mason's spotter card. The record was being built, not by one person, not in one room, in pieces by the people who had been close enough to the truth to recognize it. That was how records got corrected, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the accumulation of accurate accounts from people who chose accuracy over convenience. She picked up the MK-14. The scope was zeroed, verified. Perfect, not field, perfect, not close enough, perfect, but precisely and documentably perfect. She carried it back to the equipment rack, cleared it, tagged it, and signed it in. She stood in the armory for a moment after. The day was behind her, all of it, the ridge and the cold, and Mason's blood and the shot, and the helicopter, and the debrief, and Hargrove's words, and the photograph of the man who had sold her team's route. She let it sit behind her where it belonged. Not gone, not forgotten, behind her. Then she walked out of the armory and down the corridor toward the quarters building. And as she walked, she made two decisions that felt in the way that the most important decisions feel less like choices and more like recognitions. She was going to write the letter to Marcus Webb's mother, and she was going to put her real name on it, not her call sign, not her designation, not the official version of who she was on any particular document at any particular moment in time. Her name, Ava Carter, the name she had been born with and had carried through every iteration of what she had been asked to be and had refused to stop being. Ghost was a call sign. The system had thought it was a warning, a label for something that exceeded safe parameters, something that needed to be contained and renamed and filed away in a designation that didn't fit. The mountain had demonstrated otherwise. Ghost was not a warning. Ghost was a promise. And on the ridge above a frozen valley in the Colorado high country, with a drifted scope and a spent casing in 90 seconds that everyone else would have said didn't exist, Ava Carter had kept it.